The morning sun peeked through the dense clouds, casting a faint golden hue over the bustling streets of the city. It was a typical weekday. Pedestrians hurriedly walked past each other, their faces buried in their phones, while street vendors called out to passers-by to buy their wares. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of sizzling food from nearby stalls. Amid the chaos, no one seemed to notice the man sitting quietly on the corner of the sidewalk, his head bowed low and his clothes tattered and unkempt. To any observer, he appeared to be another homeless beggar, a figure easily overlooked in the relentless pace of the city's life. His name was William Hayes, though no one would have guessed he was, in fact, the billionaire owner of Hayes Enterprises, a name synonymous with luxury and power. William had traded his designer suits and polished shoes for rags, his hair intentionally disheveled, and his face marked with fake grime. This was no ordinary day for him, it was the day he planned to test the true nature of people's kindness. Hi everyone, welcome to Fable Tales. Today I'm excited to share a new story with you. William's decision to disguise himself stemmed from an unsettling conversation he'd overheard at his own company. "No one cares about the poor anymore," one of his senior managers had said. "They're just a nuisance, lazy and entitled." The comment had lingered with him, gnawing at his conscience. William had built his empire on the promise of giving back, of creating opportunities, but had he lost touch with the very values he'd once cherished? The experiment was simple. He would spend the day as a beggar and see how people treated him. Would they offer him kindness or ignore him as if he didn't exist? Armed with nothing but a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Please help," and a cup for coins, William stationed himself in front of a bustling cafe known for its affluent clientele. The irony was not lost on him. Just a day before, he had enjoyed a lavish meal inside this very cafe, surrounded by people eager to please him. As he sat there, the world seemed to move past him at an alarming speed. The sharp contrast between his true identity and his current appearance began to weigh heavily on him. He noticed every detail, the slight hesitation in people's steps as they approached him, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact, the whispers and judgmental glances. A mother pulled her child closer as they walked by, her expression a mixture of pity and disdain. William's first interaction came from a man in a suit who stopped momentarily, reaching into his pocket. For a brief moment, hope flickered in William's chest. But the man simply pulled out his phone, adjusted his tie, and walked away without so much as a glance. The day continued in this vein. Countless feet passed by, some hurried, some leisurely, but none stopped to acknowledge him. The subtle tension in William's heart grew heavier with each passing hour. Despite the noise of the city, the emptiness around him felt deafening. The cafe's outdoor seating area was particularly revealing. He could hear snippets of conversations, laughter, and the clinking of cups, all so close yet so distant. It reminded him of the invisible barrier that separated the privileged from the less fortunate. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, beads of sweat formed on William's brow. He hadn't expected the physical discomfort of sitting on the hard pavement for hours or the emotional toll of being treated as if he were invisible. It was humbling and, more than anything, heartbreaking. A young couple walked past, the woman glancing at him briefly before whispering to her partner, "Why doesn't he just get a job?" Her words stung more than he anticipated. But not everyone ignored him. A small boy, no older than 6, approached him with a timid smile. "Mom, can I give him my snack?" the boy asked, holding a bag of chips. His mother hesitated but eventually nodded. The boy handed the chips to William, his eyes filled with a pure, innocent kindness that took William by surprise. "Thank you," William said softly, his voice cracking. The boy's mother, however, quickly ushered him away, casting a wary glance over her shoulder. As the day wore on, William's faith in humanity wavered. The small acts of kindness were overshadowed by the overwhelming indifference he faced. A few people threw coins into his cup, but most walked by without a second thought. A group of teenagers laughed as they pretended to drop money, only to pull their hands back at the last second. William's hands clenched tightly around his sign, but he forced himself to remain still. The evening brought a colder breeze, and the once vibrant streets began to empty as people retreated to their homes. William remained in his spot, his mind racing with thoughts. He had always believed in the inherent goodness of people, but today's experience challenged that belief. Was the world truly this cold, or had he simply been too blind to see it all along? The first stage of William's journey had revealed a harsh reality, but it was far from over. Little did he know, the events of the evening would bring both heartbreak and hope, altering his perspective forever. As the day unfolded, William Hayes sat, hunched over in his makeshift beggar's clothes, feeling the weight of his disguise pressing down on him both physically and emotionally. With the sun now sitting high in the sky, the city had begun to pulsate with energy, its streets growing increasingly crowded. The cafe behind him, still as busy as ever, continued to buzz with the chatter of customers who seemed blissfully unaware of the scene unfolding just outside. William shifted slightly, the rough fabric of his clothes irritating his skin, but he refused to move. He needed to see more. He needed to understand. It wasn't long before the first wave of discomfort began to set in. People had already passed by him with barely a glance, some were too busy to care, others too uncomfortable to even acknowledge his presence. William could feel the heavy weight of their indifference, the subtle yet deliberate avoidance, as if he were a ghost in the midst of the living. His gaze lingered on the faces of the people who walked past, most of them looking through him rather than at him, their eyes darting away whenever they made contact. A woman in a business suit hurried past, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she glanced at him with mild distaste. She barely slowed down when she saw him. Another one of those, lazy ones, she muttered under her breath, her voice filled with judgment. William flinched, the words stinging more than he anticipated. They echoed in his mind, and he realized with a bitter pang that he had no real defense to offer. He'd never been in the shoes of those less fortunate before, he'd been too far removed from it. It seemed his wealth had granted him an invisible shield from the harsh truths of life. Minutes later, a young man, no older than 20, approached, his eyes scanning the street and then landing on William. The young man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering between William and the ground. He walked past without a word, but then stopped abruptly, turning back as if conflicted. He pulled a crumpled dollar bill from his wallet and dropped it into William's cup without making eye contact. "I guess you'll need it more than me," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. William's heart fluttered. For a fleeting moment, he felt a rush of relief, of hope that someone, anyone, had recognized his humanity. But the feeling quickly dissipated as the young man continued on his way, barely acknowledging the act of kindness he had just extended. The encounter, though well-meaning, felt impersonal and rushed, an act of charity given with a sense of obligation rather than genuine empathy. As the afternoon wore on, the initial rush of activity in the cafe began to subside. A lull fell over the area as the lunch crowd began to thin, and the few remaining patrons settled in for their coffee and desserts. William noticed a middle-aged man sitting at a table just outside the cafe's windows, his suit pristine, his demeanor that of a man who had made it. His eyes occasionally flickered over to William, but he seemed more absorbed in his phone than anything else. William felt the weight of his gaze. It was a look that was too familiar, a look of superiority and discomfort. The man's eyes scanned William for a moment, as if he were some kind of experiment, an oddity to be observed but not engaged with. When the man finally stood up to leave, he walked past William, his briefcase swinging by his side. William could see his lips twitch as if holding back a sneer. "Get a job, you lazy fool," the man muttered under his breath, so low that William almost didn't hear it. But he did. The words felt like a slap, sharp and unforgiving, burning a hole in his chest. By now, William's patience was wearing thin. He could feel his spine aching from the awkward position he had been sitting in for hours. His stomach, which had been growling earlier, was now an empty pit, gnawing at him. The hunger was a cruel reminder of the truth he had been trying to avoid. This wasn't just about testing people's kindness. It was about testing his own assumptions, his own beliefs about the world, about the divide between the haves and have-nots. He had lived a life where everything was at his fingertips: money, power, respect. But here, in this chair, he felt utterly powerless. Just then, a young woman walked by with a dog on a leash, its tail wagging enthusiastically as it tugged at the leash. She glanced at William, her eyes softening as she made eye contact. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out a granola bar. "You look hungry," she said, her voice kind but wary. She crouched down and offered it to him, her expression gentle, yet filled with the quiet tension of a woman who knew she was doing something outside her comfort zone. William accepted the food, his hands trembling as he took it from her. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Her kindness was like a balm to his wounded spirit. But as she straightened up to leave, she glanced back at him one last time, her face contorting with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can really help," she murmured, before quickly walking away, the dog happily trotting beside her. The granola bar was the best thing William had tasted all day, but the interaction left him conflicted. She had offered him something, but her hesitation had been evident. It was as if she were unsure whether her kindness was the right thing to do, as if helping someone like him was a transaction, a checkmark on her conscience. Later in the afternoon, as the sky turned overcast and the temperature dropped, William's exhaustion became palpable. His body ached from sitting too long, and he began to lose hope that the world could truly be different than he had thought. That was when he noticed a man in his late 50s walking towards him. This man, unlike the others, did not look away, nor did he avoid eye contact. Instead, he slowed his pace and stopped in front of William, his face thoughtful. He was scruffy, his clothes worn, yet there was an air of dignity about him that struck William. The man spoke, his voice calm and steady. "You know, you don't have to sit out here. There's a shelter just a few blocks away. They'll feed you, let you rest." He looked down at William, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. William, stunned by the man's directness and the sincerity in his voice, opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. He was overwhelmed, not just by the offer of help, but by the presence of this man who seemed to understand something William had failed to see before, the deep and silent pain of being invisible in the world. The man gave him a small nod, as if to say goodbye, and walked on. For the first time all day, William was left speechless, struck by the realization that there were people in the world who understood without judgment, who saw beyond appearances and saw the human being within. But before he could fully process the encounter, the final blow came. The cafe's manager, Marcella, emerged from the building, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She stood over him, arms crossed, her expression cold. "You're still here?" she asked, her voice laced with frustration. "I told you, you're not welcome here. I've already told you, get out. We don't want your kind hanging around." Her words cut deeper than any physical pain could have. William's heart sank. He felt his hope slip away entirely as he sat there, the weight of his own vulnerability crushing him. The manager's words were a brutal reminder that kindness was a luxury for some, a fleeting gesture for others, and something to be dismissed for people like him. As the day drew to a close and the streets grew quieter, William was left to contemplate the painful truth. His experiment had shown him something he hadn't expected. Not only had people ignored him, they had actively dismissed him as less than human. The kindness he had received had been rare, hesitant, and often laced with judgment. And as he sat there, he began to wonder if he, too, had ever truly seen the world as it was, not through the lens of privilege, but through the raw, honest eyes of those who struggled every day. As the sun began to set and the city streets were bathed in the orange glow of twilight, William Hayes remained in his spot, feeling a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. He had spent the day as an invisible man, overlooked and dismissed by the very people he had hoped to understand. The weight of his disguise and the harsh truths it had revealed pressed heavily on his spirit. Just as he was about to rise and leave, thinking his experiment had run its course, a sudden commotion from the cafe behind him made him pause. Marcella, the cafe manager, had emerged once again, her sharp voice cutting through the chatter of the evening crowd as she stormed towards him. "I told you to leave," she snapped, her eyes blazing with anger. The sound of her voice silenced the nearby diners, who turned to watch the unfolding drama with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. William, caught off guard by her aggression, looked up at her, his weary eyes meeting her piercing gaze. "You're scaring away my customers. Do you have no shame? Just sitting here all day, expecting handouts." Marcella's voice rose with each word, her tone dripping with disdain. The crowd began to murmur, some whispering in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. William's throat tightened as he realized he had become the center of attention, not as a person, but as a spectacle. His heart pounded, a mix of humiliation and frustration boiling within him. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his voice felt caught in his chest. Before he could muster a response, an elderly woman seated at one of the cafe's outdoor tables stood up. Her silver hair glinted in the fading sunlight, and her kind, weathered face bore an expression of quiet determination. "Enough," she said firmly, her voice carrying a surprising strength. The crowd fell silent as she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Marcella. "Have you no decency, treating another human being this way?" Marcella turned to the woman, her lips curling in irritation. "With all due respect, ma'am, this man is loitering. He's disturbing my business." The woman crossed her arms, her posture unwavering. "And what kind of business do you think you're running when you treat people like garbage? This man has done nothing to you, and yet here you are, humiliating him in front of everyone." Her words struck like a hammer, silencing even Marcella for a moment. William's eyes filled with tears as he watched the exchange, the kindness of this stranger cutting through the bitterness that had consumed his day. He could feel the tension in the air as the onlookers waited to see how Marcella would respond. The manager, visibly flustered, took a step back but quickly regained her composure. "If you care so much, why don't you take him home with you?" she sneered, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I just might," the woman replied without hesitation, her tone steady and calm. The crowd murmured in surprise, and Marcella's eyes widened, caught off guard by the unexpected response. At that moment, another voice rang out, this one belonging to a man in his early 30s who had been sitting near the back of the cafe. "You know, she's right," he said, standing up and addressing Marcella directly. "We all walked by him today, pretending he wasn't there. But that doesn't mean he deserves to be treated like this." The man's words rippled through the crowd, and several heads nodded in agreement. Emboldened by the growing support, another patron spoke up. "What if he's not who you think he is? What if he's someone who just needs help? We don't know his story." William felt a lump rise in his throat as he listened to the voices around him. For the first time all day, he felt truly seen, not as a beggar, but as a human being. The confrontation had shifted the dynamic entirely, and he could see Marcella struggling to maintain control of the situation. "You all think you're so righteous," Marcella snapped, her face red with anger. "But none of you did anything to help him before. So why now? Why do you care all of a sudden?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then the elderly woman stepped forward again, her voice soft but firm. "Because it's never too late to do the right thing." She turned to William, her eyes filled with compassion. "Sir, would you like to come inside and have a meal? My treat." William, overwhelmed by the kindness being shown to him, could barely nod. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Thank you." The woman smiled and extended her hand, helping him to his feet. The crowd watched in silence as she guided him toward the cafe, her actions speaking louder than any words could. Marcella, defeated and embarrassed, stepped aside, her face a mask of suppressed anger. Inside the cafe, the elderly woman found a table for William and sat down across from him. The other patrons returned to their seats, but the atmosphere had shifted. The cafe, once filled with indifference and judgment, now buzzed with a newfound sense of empathy and reflection. As William sat down, his hands still trembling, the woman reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "You don't have to explain anything," she said softly. "Just know that not everyone in the world is cruel." At that moment, William felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. The experiment he had started as a way to test others' kindness had become something far greater, a lesson in vulnerability, humanity, and the power of compassion. But the turning point was not just about the kindness of strangers. It was about William confronting his own privilege and understanding the depth of the divide between those who have and those who have not. The experience had stripped him of his defenses, forcing him to see the world through the eyes of the invisible, the overlooked, the forgotten. As he took his first bite of the warm meal in front of him, tears streamed down his face. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him, but so did the hope sparked by the kindness of a few brave souls. In that moment, William vowed to use his wealth and influence to bridge the gap he had witnessed, to ensure that no one would ever feel as invisible as he had felt that day. As William sat at the corner of the bustling cafe, reflecting on the day's humiliations and fleeting acts of kindness, the elderly woman who had shown him compassion earlier approached his table again, her expression now mixed with curiosity and hesitation. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder and said, "You remind me of someone I once knew." Her words, though soft, carried a weight that caught William off guard, and he looked up at her, confused but intrigued. She continued, explaining that years ago, she had been a caretaker for a young boy whose family had fallen on hard times, and though they had been wealthy once, a tragedy had left them struggling to rebuild their lives. "That boy," she added, her voice trembling, "used to wear a bracelet just like the one you have on your wrist. His name was William too." Her revelation sent a jolt through him as he realized that this stranger knew more about his past than he could have imagined. Startled, William glanced at the bracelet on his wrist, a keepsake he rarely removed, gifted to him by his mother before her passing. It had his initials engraved on it, a detail so specific that it left no room for coincidence. "It was you," the woman said, her eyes now brimming with tears. "You're the boy I used to care for. Your parents, they were good people, but they trusted the wrong ones. They lost everything because of betrayal, and you went away before I ever knew what became of you." The revelation struck William like a lightning bolt, unraveling memories he had buried deep within. He remembered the tough years of his childhood, when his parents had lost their fortune, and how they had been forced to rely on the kindness of strangers to survive. His family's rise back to prominence had been a story of grit and determination, but it had come at a cost. William had forgotten the very people who had helped them during their darkest times. The woman's face was now etched with hope and pain, as if she were trying to reconcile the homeless man she saw before her with the little boy she once comforted. "I always wondered what happened to you," she whispered. "And here you are, pretending to be someone you're not. But why?" William's heart raced as he struggled to process the depth of her words. His disguise had been a means to test humanity, but now it felt like humanity was testing him. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he admitted the truth. "I wanted to see if people were still kind," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "I thought I could understand what it feels like to have nothing, but I never expected to find someone who knew me from when I had nothing." The woman gave him a long, searching look, her expression softening as she placed her hand over his. "Kindness is rare, William," she said. "But it exists. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's loud, but it's there. And it starts with people like you who remember what it's like to be on the other side." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken truths, and William realized the depth of his own privilege and the distance he had placed between himself and his past. He had spent years building a life of luxury, but in doing so, he had lost touch with the struggles that had shaped him. The woman's unexpected appearance wasn't just a twist in his experiment, it was a mirror, forcing him to confront who he had become and what he needed to change. As they sat together in the fading light, the noise of the cafe around them dimmed, and William made a silent vow to honor the kindness he had been shown as a child, and to ensure that no one else would ever feel as invisible as he had felt that day. As the woman's revelation settled over William like a heavy but enlightening blanket, the bustling city around them began to fade into the background. Sitting across from the one person who had unknowingly connected him to his forgotten past, William felt both humbled and conflicted. He had come out to test the kindness of strangers, but in the process, he had uncovered his own ignorance of what true compassion entailed. The elderly woman, whose name he learned was Margaret, continued to speak softly, recounting memories of the little boy she had once cared for. Her voice was tinged with both warmth and sorrow, and every word she spoke painted vivid images of a past William had locked away in pursuit of success. As Margaret described the struggles of his family and their determination to rise again, William realized just how deeply her kindness had shaped his parents' will to persevere, even though they had never spoken much about her. They always believed in people, Margaret said, her voice faltering slightly, even when the world turned its back on them. William's chest tightened as her words took root. The very values he thought he upheld as a businessman now seemed distant and diluted, buried under years of corporate strategies and wealth accumulation. He gazed down at his hands, still covered in the grime of his disguise, and felt a sharp pang of shame. "I've lost my way," he admitted quietly, his voice carrying the weight of realization. Margaret smiled gently, placing a comforting hand on his. "No, William," she said firmly, "you're finding it again. That's what matters." Her words sparked something within him, a resolve to not just understand kindness but to embody it, to turn this humbling experience into meaningful action. As the cafe lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the streets, William felt an urge to set things right. The crowd that had gathered during Marcella's outburst had largely dispersed, but a few curious onlookers lingered, stealing glances at the pair through the cafe windows. William stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and reached for the wallet hidden in his tattered jacket. Pulling out a crisp bill, he approached the cafe's counter, where Marcella was busy avoiding eye contact with him. "For the food," he said softly, placing the money on the counter. The manager looked up, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. "You didn't need to," she began, but William cut her off with a calm yet firm tone. "Everyone deserves dignity, Marcella. Remember that." His words hung in the air as he turned and walked back to Margaret, leaving the cafe manager with a visible shift in her demeanor. Margaret watched him with quiet pride as he sat back down. "That was brave," she said, her eyes glistening. William shook his head. "It's not bravery," he replied, "it's responsibility." The two shared a moment of silence, the gravity of the day weighing on them both. Then, almost as if driven by an unseen force, William made a decision. "Come with me," he said, his voice steady but inviting. Margaret hesitated, but the sincerity in his eyes convinced her to follow. Together, they walked through the now quieter streets until they reached a modest but elegant building. As they stepped inside, Margaret's eyes widened in astonishment. The lobby was adorned with warm lighting and inviting furniture, a stark contrast to the cold streets they had left behind. "This is one of my properties," William explained as they entered an office space. "It's meant to be a shelter for those in need, but I've been too focused on other ventures to give it the attention it deserves." He paused, looking around the room with a newfound sense of purpose. "That changes now." Turning to Margaret, he added, "I want you to help me run it. You understand people in ways I never could, and you've shown me today what true kindness looks like." Margaret was taken aback, her hands trembling as she processed his words. "William, I'm just an old woman," she said, her voice quivering. "What could I possibly offer?" William smiled, his eyes brimming with determination. "Everything," he replied. "You've lived through struggles, seen the best and worst of humanity, and still found ways to give. That's exactly what this place needs, someone who understands what it means to help, not just from a position of privilege, but from a place of genuine compassion." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging and purpose. Over the following weeks, the shelter became a beacon of hope in the community. William threw himself into the project, investing not just his money but his time and energy. He met with individuals and families who had fallen on hard times, listening to their stories and finding ways to offer meaningful support. Margaret became the heart of the shelter, her warmth and wisdom creating an atmosphere of trust and safety for everyone who walked through its doors. William's transformation did not go unnoticed. The media soon caught wind of the millionaire who had gone undercover as a beggar and was now dedicating his resources to helping the less fortunate. While some praised his efforts, others questioned his motives, accusing him of using the experience as a publicity stunt. But William remained steadfast, knowing that his actions spoke louder than any words. For him, the shelter was not about redemption or recognition, it was about fulfilling a responsibility he had long neglected. One evening, as William and Margaret sat in the shelter's common area, watching children play and families share meals, Margaret turned to him with a smile. "Your parents would be proud," she said softly. William looked around the room, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I hope so," he replied. "But more than that, I hope the people here feel seen and valued. That's what matters most." The shelter became more than just a place of refuge, it became a symbol of what could be achieved when compassion and action worked hand in hand. And for William, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where he no longer measured success by wealth or status but by the impact he could have on the lives of others. After weeks of dedicating himself to the shelter and reconnecting with the values he had once forgotten, William Hayes stood in the middle of the bustling common area, watching as the lives he had touched began to flourish. Families laughed as they shared meals, children played with toys that donors had provided, and the once hollow-eyed faces of the shelter's residents now carried a spark of hope. Margaret, now the heart and soul of the place, moved through the room with her warm, steady presence, comforting those in need and ensuring everything ran smoothly. William had transformed the empty property into a thriving sanctuary, a beacon of kindness and compassion that stood in stark contrast to the cold indifference he had experienced during his experiment. One day, as he sat quietly in the corner, observing the lives he had helped rebuild, a young man approached him hesitantly, clutching a small, crumpled envelope. "This is for you," the man said, his voice shaky but filled with gratitude. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note thanking William for giving him a second chance and a small donation, everything the man could afford, meant to help others the way William had helped him. Touched by the gesture, William felt tears prick his eyes, the man's gratitude serving as a powerful reminder of the ripple effects of kindness. As the shelter continued to grow, word spread across the city, attracting volunteers, resources, and even media attention. Reporters clamored for interviews, but William remained focused on the work, his actions speaking louder than any words he could offer. During one particularly busy afternoon, Marcella, the cafe manager who had once dismissed him so cruelly, appeared at the shelter's door. Her face was a mixture of shame and resolve as she approached him, clutching a small donation box. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I've realized how much harm I caused. I want to help." William looked at her for a long moment, his gaze soft but piercing, before offering her a small, forgiving smile. "Kindness isn't just about the past," he said. "It's about what we choose to do moving forward." Marcella's face crumpled with emotion, and she promised to dedicate herself to the shelter's cause, joining the growing network of people inspired by William's journey. In the weeks that followed, the shelter became more than just a refuge, it turned into a movement. People from all walks of life came forward to share their stories, to offer their support, and to remind one another of the power of compassion. Margaret, with her unyielding warmth, became a symbol of resilience and love, guiding William as he found new ways to expand the shelter's reach. But the most profound moment came on a quiet evening, when William stood before a small plaque that had been mounted in the shelter's entryway. It bore his parents' names, a tribute to the values they had instilled in him and the struggles they had overcome. Margaret stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "They would be proud," she said softly, her voice filled with certainty. William nodded, his heart full of a peace he had not felt in years. "This isn't just for them," he replied. "It's for everyone who's ever felt invisible, for everyone who's needed someone to believe in them." As the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, William walked through the shelter one last time before heading home, his steps unhurried and his mind clear. The faces he passed, smiling, hopeful, alive, were a testament to the power of a single decision, a single act of vulnerability that had blossomed into a transformative journey. He had set out to test the kindness of others but had instead rediscovered his own humanity. The experience had reshaped not only his understanding of wealth and privilege but also his definition of success. In the end, William realized that the greatest legacy one could leave was not the size of their fortune but the impact of their kindness. The shelter stood as a living reminder of that truth, a place where dignity was restored, lives were rebuilt, and hope was given a chance to thrive. And as William walked out into the cool night air, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his journey was only just beginning. As William sat outside the bustling cafe, his tattered clothes and weary demeanor blending into the background of the city's noise, the sting of humanity's indifference weighed heavily on him. His experiment had revealed much about the world and even more about himself. Every passing stranger's dismissive glance or cruel word chipped away at his resolve, yet it was the rare moments of kindness, a child offering him a snack, an elderly woman defending his dignity, that ignited a spark of hope. These fleeting acts reminded him that while the world often feels harsh, kindness can still break through. Now, as the evening approached and William reflected on the day's events, a sense of urgency gripped him, not for himself, but for the stories he had uncovered and the lessons he had learned. Have you ever felt invisible, like no one truly sees you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and we'd love to hear from you. As he prepared to leave his post, he noticed a young woman who had passed him earlier, now hesitating at the corner. Her face bore a conflicted expression as she finally turned back and approached him, dropping a small sandwich and a bottle of water into his lap without saying a word. Her silent gesture spoke volumes, and William felt a lump rise in his throat. This moment wasn't just about the food, it was about being seen. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like and share, it helps bring more awareness to stories like these. As William stepped away from the cafe for the last time that day, he felt an odd mix of heartbreak and hope. His disguise had shown him the best and worst of humanity, and it had reshaped his understanding of his own privilege. This wasn't just an experiment, it was a wake-up call. If you've ever wondered how small acts of kindness can change someone's life, now is the time to take action. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Together, we can inspire a kinder world.